In the shadowed hollows of Appalachia, where the mountains swallow light and silence reigns like a judge, the Tollett family's name is whispered, never spoken aloud. Not just because of fear, but because what happened here was not merely a crime, it was a fracture in the very fabric of trust and humanity. The Tolletts were not just another family lost to rural despair, they were a symbol of something far darker, a festering wound in a community already haunted by its ghosts. It began decades ago with a string of disappearances that nobody dared connect, each missing person another thread pulled from the fragile tapestry of Appalachia's hidden truths. These were not random victims. The Tolletts were ensnared in a pattern so complex, so suffocatingly deliberate, it suggested a force more sinister than a single murderer, a network. What set this case apart was the chilling involvement of those sworn to protect, law enforcement, local officials, even clergy, people whose names and faces mask the rot beneath. Behind closed doors, deals were struck, evidence buried, and cries for justice drowned in a sea of indifference and power. The family itself seemed cursed, or perhaps chosen, to bear witness to a systematic eradication masked as misfortune and tragedy. But the story doesn't just rest on the dead or the missing, it thrives in the silence, the complicity, and the whispered threats that still echo through the misted valleys. When you peel back the layers, you realize this is no mere crime story. It is a blueprint for control, a demonstration of how fear and secrecy can bind a community, how the invisible chains of corruption crush lives without leaving a trace. What you're about to hear is not comfortable. It will challenge everything you think you know about justice, family, and the power that hides behind a friendly face. This is the story of Appalachia's deadliest secret, the Tollett family, and it will change the way you see darkness forever. The Tollett family had long been pillars of their mountain community, hard-working, weathered but unyielding. They farmed the rocky soil, hunted the dense woods, and raised their children under a canopy of secrets older than the trees themselves. But beneath their sturdy exterior, the family was unraveling, pulled apart by a series of deaths no one could explain. It started with Daniel Tollett, the eldest son, found hanging in the barn one bleak autumn morning. Officially ruled a suicide, but those who knew him whispered of something far more sinister. His eyes had carried a haunted look in the weeks before, as if he'd seen something that broke his mind. Then came Mary, his younger sister, disappearing without a trace after a church gathering, her footsteps swallowed by the dense forest that bordered their property. Search parties found no sign, no struggle, no clue, only a pair of worn boots abandoned near the creek. Panic spread quietly, but fear held tighter. The locals said the land itself was cursed, but the truth was worse. The Tolletts were tangled in a web of silent watchers and unspoken threats. Police investigations were stonewalled, evidence lost or dismissed, witnesses scared into silence. And then the whispers began, about a shadowy figure seen near the family's home, a man who wore the face of authority but moved like a predator. He came and went like a ghost, seen only in fleeting glimpses, always leaving behind a chilling sense of dread. The Tolletts were caught in something they could neither fight nor flee, a malevolent force that thrived on their pain and isolation. Their story was being erased, overwritten by lies and complacency. Every attempt to uncover the truth was met with obstruction. Every voice raised in protest was silenced. But the mountain remembers. It keeps the bones, the broken hearts, the secrets, and now you must remember too, because some truths refuse to die and some shadows are waiting to be brought into the light. This is no ordinary tragedy. It is a calculated erasure, a deliberate act of cruelty masked by the wilderness and the silence of men sworn to keep it. The local sheriff's office was the first line of defense, at least on paper. But in the dark hollows surrounding the Tollett farm, the sheriff's presence was more a menace than a shield. Records reveal a pattern of botched investigations and suspiciously ignored leads, each one pointing toward a deliberate cover-up. A confidential source, a former deputy who left under mysterious circumstances, spoke of orders from above, cryptic instructions to close cases quickly, to keep questions off the table. The sheriff's deputies, many of them lifelong friends of the Tollett family, wore loyalty like a weapon, protecting the network, not the victims. Meanwhile, the Tollett matriarch, Elizabeth, fought desperately to expose the truth. She petitioned for federal intervention, wrote letters to state authorities, and confronted local officials who met her with thin smiles and thicker walls of silence. But the deeper she dug, the more dangerous her quest became. Strange cars watched her home at night. Unmarked threats whispered over phone lines. The family's youngest, Tommy, began to talk of the man in the woods who told him to be quiet. When Tommy vanished shortly after, the community understood that the stakes were no longer about justice but survival. This was no longer a simple case of rural crime. It was a lesson in power and fear. The Tolletts had stumbled onto a hidden world where rules were rewritten, where truth was the enemy, and where the innocent paid with their lives. For outsiders, Appalachia is a place of rugged beauty and resilient people, but beneath the surface, the land holds scars invisible to the casual eye. The Tollett family's nightmare is carved into the soil, buried beneath layers of lies and decades of institutional rot. This darkness is not just a relic of the past. It is alive, breathing, and waiting. And as the sun sets over the mist-covered peaks, the question remains: how many others have been swallowed whole by this silence? How many families carry the same invisible chains, bound by fear and broken promises? To know the Tollett story is to step through a doorway into a world few dare enter, a world where the truth is the most dangerous secret of all. The Tollett family's home was more than a simple farmhouse. It was a fortress of despair. The walls bore the weight of whispered confessions, of nights spent listening for footsteps that never came, and of a creeping dread that seeped into every corner. Elizabeth Tollett kept a diary, a desperate attempt to hold on to reality as her world crumbled. In it, she detailed the subtle threats, the coded warnings left on her doorstep, the strange figures lurking beyond the tree line. Each entry read like a countdown to inevitable tragedy, yet no one outside could hear her cries. One night, Elizabeth described a chilling encounter, a knock at the door, soft and hesitant, followed by a voice she recognized but couldn't place. The visitor left behind a single object, a worn badge with no name, an unspoken message that the watchers were closer than she dared believe. Meanwhile, the local church, once a sanctuary, became a silent accomplice. Clergy members preached forgiveness and patience, urging the family to trust the good men in authority. But beneath the hymns and sermons was an undercurrent of fear, a shared understanding that to speak out was to invite destruction. Parishioners whispered of strange disappearances tied to the church's events, and rumors spread of secret meetings held deep in the woods where deals were made in shadows. The church's pulpit became a tool not of salvation but of control, reinforcing the chains that bound the Tolletts and others like them. And as the family's tragedy unfolded, the wider community turned its gaze away, choosing denial over confrontation. Friends vanished from social circles, neighbors refused to answer questions. The Tollett name became a curse. Utter it too loudly and you risked becoming the next victim. The fabric of trust was ripped apart, replaced by a culture of silence that stretched far beyond the mountains. It was as if an invisible hand had drawn a circle around the family, trapping them in a nightmare with no escape. But nightmares do not stay buried forever. The darkness that swallowed the Tolletts was waiting to be unearthed, its roots reaching deep into the soil of power and corruption. The question now is not if the truth will come out, but when, and what it will demand of those who dare to listen. The disappearance of Tommy Tollett shattered whatever fragile hope remained. The boy was only 10, small enough to be overlooked by those who didn't want to see, yet his absence screamed through the community like a siren in the night. Officially, the case was closed within days. Runaway child, they said, with no further pursuit. But for Elizabeth and those who dared listen, the silence was deafening. Tommy's last words, spoken in trembling whispers, haunted the family. "He watches in the woods. Don't let him find me." That "he" was never identified, but the fear in that small voice spoke volumes about the predator lurking just beyond the trees. Rumors spread of strange men seen near the Tollett property, figures clad in dark clothes, faces obscured by shadows, moving with the deliberate purpose of hunters. Some said they were agents of a hidden syndicate. Others whispered of local officials who used the guise of authority to mask their sinister deeds. The Tollets were not just victims of a random criminal, they were caught in a system designed to erase them. Surveillance cameras mysteriously failed, phone lines went dead during moments of crisis, and witnesses who tried to speak out disappeared from the public eye. The very institutions meant to protect became instruments of suppression. Then came the discovery in the woods, a hidden clearing, marked by crude symbols carved into ancient oaks, a place that spoke of ritual and warning. Items belonging to missing family members were found scattered there, worn shoes, a child's toy, a tattered piece of fabric. But no bodies. It was as if the land itself was swallowing the proof, leaving only fragments of a nightmare too terrible to confront. The Tollett tragedy was no isolated incident. It was a fragment of a larger design, a system built on fear, obedience, and silence. And yet, for all the darkness, a spark of resistance remained. Those few who remembered the truth, who dared to question, were the last line against the abyss. To understand the depths of this horror, you must look beyond the surface, the corruption, the manipulation, the lies, and see the human cost. The Tollett family was sacrificed on an altar of secrecy, their pain weaponized to keep others in line. But secrets, no matter how deeply buried, have a way of clawing back into the light. The story of Appalachia's Deadliest is far from over. No one in the Tollett family was safe from the creeping poison that spread through their lives. After Tommy vanished, the remaining family members lived in a state of constant vigilance, their eyes darting to every shadow, their ears straining for every whisper carried by the wind. But the Watchers didn't limit themselves to physical threats. Psychological warfare became their weapon of choice. Elizabeth's husband, Jacob, once a proud and steady man, began to unravel under the weight of fear and suspicion. His work disappeared, opportunities evaporated without explanation, and strange accidents, broken tools, fires that started without cause, plagued him relentlessly. Neighbors, once friendly, turned cold, doors closed in his face. Jacob's mind fractured as he became convinced that an unseen force was orchestrating his downfall, that the very earth beneath their feet conspired to crush them. The local hospital, too, played its role in this web of control. When Elizabeth sought medical help for her deteriorating mental state, she was met with indifference or dismissals attributed to mountain hysteria. Records later revealed that reports of abuse or threats were systematically lost or altered, ensuring no official record could ignite an investigation. The network's reach was so deep, so carefully woven, that it transcended individual institutions. It was a silent code of complicity written across the community. At night, the family would huddle in whispers, trying to piece together the fragmented truths they had gleaned. They spoke of strange phone calls with no voices on the other end, of vehicles circling their property at odd hours, of men who carried no badges but spoke with authority. The terror was no longer just physical, it was a suffocating paranoia that turned every friend into a potential enemy. Even the children, once bright and hopeful, learned to mask their fear behind hollow smiles. It was a sinister lesson in survival taught by the darkest teachers, and as the years stretched on, the Tollets became ghosts, living but broken, present yet absent. Their story was quietly erased from public memory, but not from the land itself. Appalachia's mountains remember, and they whisper the truth to those who dare listen. Power can hide behind the most ordinary faces, and sometimes the deadliest crimes are the ones nobody wants to see. This is not just a story about one family. It's a mirror held up to a society that turned its back on its own. The years passed like a slow, agonizing march toward oblivion, but the shadow that engulfed the Tollets only grew darker and more insidious. One night a stranger appeared at the edge of their property, a man whose presence sent a cold wave through the family's fragile resolve. He introduced himself as an investigator, claiming to be from an outside agency sent to reopen the cold cases surrounding the Tollett disappearances. His arrival sparked a flicker of hope, a dangerous glimmer in the midst of relentless despair. Elizabeth cautiously welcomed him in, but the man's eyes held something unsettling, too knowing, too calculated. His questions probed deeper than just the facts, twisting into psychological games that unnerved the family. It became clear this visitor was no savior but a shadow operative, tasked with unearthing their secrets for a darker purpose. In hushed tones, the stranger revealed fragments of a hidden agenda, whispers of illegal operations exploiting Appalachia's isolation, trafficking networks camouflaged beneath the veneer of rural innocence. He hinted at connections reaching into powerful political and corporate spheres, implying the Tolletts were collateral damage in a far-reaching scheme of control and profit. His words were both a threat and a confession. The deeper the family dug, the more dangerous the forces aligned against them. Shortly after the stranger's departure, a wave of new threats descended. Their power was no longer subtle, it was blatant intimidation. Car windows shattered without cause, anonymous letters containing cryptic warnings slipped under their doors, and distant gunshots echoed through the night, reminding them that escape was an illusion. The family's isolation became a cage, the mountains a prison fortified by fear and conspiracy. Elizabeth's resolve hardened. She vowed to expose the rot, to drag the puppeteers from their hidden lairs and into the unforgiving light. But even her determination was tested as allies vanished, evidence disappeared, and the lines between friend and foe blurred into a fog of distrust. The Tollett family's nightmare was no longer just about survival. It was a battle for truth against an overwhelming tide of lies. Every revelation peeled back another layer of a sinister reality, one where justice was a myth and power corrupted every institution. This was not merely a crime story. It was a portrait of a system designed to crush dissent and bury the innocent. And as you listen to this, know that the darkness still lingers, waiting to consume those who dare to seek the truth. The turning point came when Elizabeth received a phone call in the dead of night. No voice, just a faint breathing, then a click. A message clear as day. They were watching her, closer than ever before. The walls that once protected the family now felt like a cage, closing in with every passing hour. Desperation forced Elizabeth to reach out beyond the mountains, to journalists and activists known for exposing hidden corruption. But the reach of the shadow network was vast. Stories vanished before they hit the press. Emails were deleted, phone calls dropped, and sources went dark or disappeared entirely. It was a chilling reminder that power was not just local, it was systemic. One journalist who showed interest was found dead days later, ruled an accident but known among insiders as a warning to others. The message was unmistakable: silence or suffer the consequences. Meanwhile, the psychological toll on the family was unbearable. Elizabeth's husband, Jacob, slipped further into despair, muttering of shadows that moved in the daylight, voices that whispered from empty rooms. His health deteriorated rapidly, leaving Elizabeth to shoulder the burden alone. Even her children, once vibrant, grew withdrawn, haunted by nightmares and the heavy weight of their family's cursed legacy. The community remained complicit, turning blind eyes, shutting down conversations, refusing to acknowledge the darkness festering beneath their feet. The church bells tolled a hollow sound, a dirge for the forgotten. Yet, within this suffocating silence, a dangerous truth lingered. The Tollett's suffering was part of a larger design, a sinister game played by faceless men with agendas hidden behind layers of bureaucracy and deceit. The mountains held their secrets well, but the truth demanded to be heard. It demanded reckoning. And so the story continues, not just a tale of one family's tragedy, but a mirror reflecting the rot at the heart of power itself. If you feel the weight of these words, if you sense the darkness pressing in around you, speak now. Repeat the phrase, "I see the shadows, I break the silence." Say it twice. Let it bind your will, and join those who refuse to be silenced. Because in the end, the real crime is not just the acts committed, but the lies that let them live forever in the dark. The fragile thread of hope that Elizabeth clung to snapped when her oldest daughter Sarah vanished one stormy night. There was no warning, no struggle, just an empty bed and a shattered family. The search was frantic but futile. The forest swallowed her without a trace. The police again dismissed it as a voluntary disappearance, a runaway case closed too quickly. But those who knew the truth understood the pattern was deliberate and merciless, erased the Tolletts piece by piece until nothing remained but silence. Behind the scenes, dark forces moved like shadows over the landscape. Records that might have exposed connections between the disappearances and local officials were mysteriously lost, or locked behind bureaucratic walls no outsider could breach. Family friends who questioned the narrative found themselves marginalized or threatened. The community's complicity was a shroud that cloaked the truth, reinforcing the illusion that the Tollett's tragedy was an isolated nightmare. But nothing could be further from the truth. The family was trapped in a web of corruption and control that stretched far beyond the mountain ridges, reaching into halls of power where decisions were made in secret. Inside the Tollett home, the psychological toll was devastating. Elizabeth's eyes bore the weight of countless sleepless nights, haunted by memories she wished to erase but could not. The line between grief and rage blurred, fueling a desperate hunger for justice that few could understand. Friends who tried to help found themselves entangled in threats and intimidation, a stark warning that this was no ordinary case. Somewhere in the darkness, a force thrived on the family's pain, orchestrating their downfall with cold precision. The deeper the investigation delved, the more evident it became that the Tolletts had uncovered a truth that many powerful entities wanted buried. A truth wrapped in layers of deception, protected by fear, and enforced by silence. As you hear this, know that the Tollett story is not just history, it is a warning. A call to look beyond the surface and question the stories fed to us by those in power. Because sometimes the most dangerous crimes are those hidden behind the mask of order and authority. The question remains, will the truth see the light, or will the shadows consume all who dare seek it? The months following Sarah's disappearance were marked by a suffocating silence that fell like a shroud over the Tollett homestead. Elizabeth, once a pillar of strength, now wandered through the wreckage of her family's life like a ghost tethered to a nightmare. The mountain winds carried the echo of her whispered prayers, unanswered and swallowed by the thick woods that had claimed her children. But even in despair, a seed of resistance took root. Late one evening, a flicker of light pierced the darkness. A letter slipped under the door with no name, no return address. Inside, a single phrase: "They fear the truth." The note was both a lifeline and a warning. Someone else knew. Someone else saw the strings pulling behind the scenes. This small spark ignited a dangerous game of trust and betrayal. Elizabeth reached out tentatively to the shadowy figure who had once claimed to be an investigator, hoping for an ally against the invisible enemy. What followed was a twisted dance of information and misinformation. The stranger's messages arrived in coded riddles, hinting at a labyrinthine conspiracy that ensnared not just the Tolletts, but countless others across Appalachia. He spoke of trafficking routes disguised as legitimate businesses, of corrupt officials exchanging favors in smoky backrooms, and of a network so vast it defied comprehension. But as the truth unfolded, so did the danger. Elizabeth realized she was being watched, her every move tracked, her contacts threatened. The network's grip tightened, a noose around her family's neck, and in the shadows new threats emerged, strangers lurking at the edge of the woods, eyes gleaming with cold intent. The very land that once nurtured the Tolletts now seemed to conspire against them, a living prison with no escape. The weight of power and corruption crushed the spirit, but the story had to be told, because beneath the veneer of rural normalcy lay a brutal reality, a calculated system of oppression that fed on fear and silenced dissent. The Tollett family's descent into darkness was a warning, an invitation to look closer, to question harder. If you understand what this means, if you feel the pull of that hidden knowledge, say it now. I see the shadows. I break the silence. Say it twice, and join the few who dare confront the darkness. For in silence the shadows grow stronger, and in knowledge there is power. In the relentless fog of fear and suspicion, Elizabeth's resolve hardened into something unyielding. The years of loss had transformed her from a grieving mother into a fierce seeker of truth, a truth buried beneath layers of deceit and complicity. She began collecting fragments, scraps of overheard conversations, shadowy figures glimpsed in the distance, inconsistencies in official reports that didn't add up. Each piece was a shard of a larger puzzle, a sinister design crafted to protect the guilty. One night, while sifting through old newspaper clippings, Elizabeth uncovered a pattern of similar disappearances stretching beyond the mountain ridge. Families broken, voices silenced, cases dismissed without cause. The Tolletts were not isolated. They were part of a vast, cold machine fueled by greed and power. But the deeper she dug, the more dangerous her quest became. Unknown vehicles began circling her property at odd hours, lights glaring into windows where no one should be. Calls came with heavy breathing on the other end, or silence so complete it screamed of threat. Even trusted friends grew wary, their eyes clouded with fear or suspicion, as if the poison of silence had seeped into every corner of the community. The local police were no allies. They acted as gatekeepers of the darkness, their badge a shield for criminals, their silence a weapon against justice. Elizabeth learned that some officers were on the payroll of shadowy interests, paid to overlook evidence, to intimidate witnesses, to erase any trace of the network's influence. The church, once a refuge, preached submission and forgiveness, its sermons thin veils masking its complicity. At the heart of this conspiracy was a brutal lesson: power corrupts absolutely, and those who wield it will do anything to preserve their dominion, no matter the cost to innocent lives. Elizabeth's story was no longer just about family. It had become a battle for the soul of Appalachia itself. She knew that exposing this darkness could cost her everything: her home, her freedom, even her life. But silence was a poison she refused to swallow. And so, with trembling hands and a steely heart, she prepared to confront the shadows directly, knowing full well the price she might pay. Because in a world ruled by fear and lies, the greatest act of courage is to speak the truth. One bitter winter evening, Elizabeth received an unexpected visitor. A man cloaked in shadows, his face obscured beneath a wide-brimmed hat pulled low. He introduced himself simply as Mason, and claimed to be a whistleblower from inside the very network suffocating her family. His arrival was a gamble, a flicker of hope wrapped in danger. Mason spoke in hushed tones, revealing pieces of the monstrous machinery that had ensnared the Tolletts. He described a hierarchy of control: local officials, corrupt law enforcement, and corporate puppeteers who profited from the exploitation of Appalachia's vulnerable. Mason's knowledge was chilling: detailed accounts of human trafficking disguised as labor recruitment, land seized through intimidation, and silence bought with fear and blood. He warned Elizabeth that her family was marked not just for what they had seen, but for what they might reveal. Mason offered cryptic instructions on how to protect herself and gather evidence, but his warnings came with a dire caveat: trust no one, and expect betrayal even from those closest. Over the following weeks, Elizabeth followed his guidance, clandestinely documenting encounters, recording whispered threats, and tracing the flow of illicit activity winding through the mountain towns. The risks were immense. Her house was broken into, files stolen or destroyed, and her family was shadowed by unseen eyes. Yet with every stolen moment of clarity, the scale of the corruption grew more horrifying. The Tollett nightmare was a microcosm of a sprawling empire built on exploitation, fear, and absolute control. Mason's presence was a double-edged sword. While he offered vital insight, his true allegiance remained uncertain. Elizabeth sensed he was running from something as much as toward the truth, perhaps even haunted by the very darkness he exposed. As the pieces fell into place, a terrifying picture emerged. A system so deeply entrenched that even the few who dared expose it were swallowed whole or turned into instruments of deception. The mountains had become a battleground, with the Tolletts caught in the crossfire of invisible wars fought in shadows. Elizabeth's resolve hardened anew. There was no turning back. To confront the darkness, she had to become part of it, and outwit the hunters stalking her every step. The stakes had never been higher, and the consequences would be brutal. But for the Tolletts, silence was no longer an option. The fragile alliance with Mason proved both a blessing and a curse. With his whispered knowledge guiding her, Elizabeth uncovered more than she ever dared imagine. Secret meetings deep in the forest, coded messages passed between local officials, and a web of complicity that reached into businesses, law enforcement, and religious institutions alike. Each discovery was a fresh wound, a reminder that the Tolletts were not merely victims but targets of a meticulously crafted system designed to crush dissent. One night, Elizabeth followed Mason's lead to a derelict warehouse on the outskirts of town, a place whispered about in hushed tones but never openly discussed. Inside, she found evidence of human trafficking operations cloaked as labor exchanges, with records indicating dozens of missing persons linked to the area. The cold, fluorescent light cast long shadows across rusted machinery and scattered documents, a grim testament to the brutal commerce thriving under the community's nose. But her presence did not go unnoticed. Unseen watchers trailed her escape, and the tension that gripped her family tightened like a noose. Mason warned that the network had eyes everywhere, and that betrayal could come from the most trusted allies. Soon, the danger became painfully personal. Friends who had offered refuge found themselves threatened. Messages scrawled in dark ink appeared on the family's property, ominous and unyielding. The line between protector and predator blurred, and Elizabeth's world contracted to the narrow line between survival and exposure. Yet even as the darkness closed in, her determination did not waver. She became a beacon for others trapped in the system, a symbol of resistance against the invisible hand crushing the mountains. Her fight was no longer just for her family, but for every voice silenced by fear. But the deeper the truth emerged, the more lethal the response. The network's machinery churned, deploying its most ruthless enforcers, men who operated without mercy or conscience. And as Elizabeth's story spread beyond Appalachia's hills, a stark warning echoed across the land. Those who dare expose the shadows risk becoming shadows themselves, forgotten, broken, or worse. Yet in the heart of this darkness, a question lingered. Could one woman's courage ignite a blaze strong enough to burn down the empire of silence? The chilling reality set in. Elizabeth was not just fighting for her family, but against a sprawling network that had weaponized silence for generations. The more she uncovered, the more apparent it became that Appalachia's rugged terrain was not just a backdrop, but a shield, natural barriers masking a sinister empire thriving in plain sight. One evening, as the sun bled behind the mountains, Elizabeth received an unmarked envelope containing photographs. Grainy, black-and-white images of officials shaking hands with known traffickers, documents listing names, dates, and covert operations. The evidence was undeniable, yet every piece came with an unspoken threat. Back off, or become the next name on the list. The network's grip extended into every corner: the courthouse where justice was a mere performance, the sheriff's office where officers were nothing more than gatekeepers for crime, the churches that preached silence and submission. This was a system built on fear, greed, and absolute control, with victims discarded and truth buried beneath layers of complicity. Elizabeth realized that exposing these secrets would demand more than courage. It would require her to become invisible in plain sight, to move like a shadow within the very darkness she sought to dismantle. But the cost was mounting. Late one night, the family's home was vandalized, windows smashed, belongings destroyed, a clear message etched into the wall with a sharp blade: "Stop digging." Yet Elizabeth's defiance only grew. She reached out to whistleblowers, survivors, and outsiders willing to listen. Together they began piecing together the tapestry of corruption, weaving a story too brutal to ignore. But with each revelation came retaliation. Friends vanished, key witnesses recanted or were discredited, and anonymous threats turned into acts of violence. The mountains echoed with the cries of those who dared resist, their stories silenced by force. And in this maelstrom, Elizabeth stood as a beacon of unyielding will, even as the shadows pressed ever closer. The Tollett family's tragedy was no longer just a local nightmare. It was a symbol of a greater evil entrenched in power and protected by silence. This is the truth few dare face. This is the darkness we must confront. And if you are listening, you have a choice. Will you turn away, or will you stand and face the shadows alongside those who refuse to be broken? As the veil of secrecy began to thin, the full scale of the corruption revealed itself in horrifying detail. Elizabeth uncovered that the disappearances were just the surface symptoms of a far deeper plague. An organized trafficking ring operating with impunity, protected by alliances between local law enforcement, corporate interests, and religious institutions. The victims, many from impoverished families like the Tolletts, were systematically exploited and erased, their fates sealed behind bureaucratic walls designed to protect the guilty. The network's reach stretched beyond Appalachia, with routes leading to distant cities and even across state lines. Elizabeth's investigations exposed how economic desperation was weaponized, luring vulnerable individuals into traps disguised as opportunity. The cruel irony was that the very institutions meant to offer salvation, police, courts, churches, were the ones perpetuating the cycle of abuse and silence. Corrupt officers turned blind eyes or actively facilitated the crimes. Judges dismissed cases without cause, and clergy preached obedience over justice. Even within the community, fear was so deeply ingrained that witnesses chose silence over safety, neighbors chose complicity over courage. The Tolletts had become unwilling symbols of resistance, their suffering a rallying cry drowned out by the oppressive machinery of corruption. Yet Elizabeth's resolve transformed her from victim to crusader. Armed with irrefutable evidence, she risked everything to reach journalists and advocacy groups willing to break the story wide open. But the network retaliated swiftly. Her allies were harassed, sources intimidated, and her family's home became a target of increasingly violent threats. The fight was no longer just for truth but for survival. In one brutal encounter, Elizabeth narrowly escaped an attempt on her life, an ambush on a low, nearly mountain road that left her shaken but undeterred. The message was clear. Some truths were considered too dangerous to reveal, and those who tried paid with blood and fear. Yet, in the darkest hours, Elizabeth's story began to resonate beyond the mountains. Activists, investigators, and survivors united, shining light on the shadows that had long been hidden. The Tollett family's nightmare exposed the fragility of justice and the price of silence. It is a warning that power unchecked becomes tyranny, and that darkness grows where light is denied. And as you listen now, remember, the story is far from over. The tension in the mountains was palpable, an unspoken menace that clung to the cold air like frost. Elizabeth's every move was shadowed, every word watched. The deeper she probed, the more she realized that the Tollett family's ordeal was a single thread in a tapestry of corruption so vast it defied comprehension. The network wasn't just a local nightmare, it was a sprawling empire built on exploitation, greed, and silence. One evening, as Elizabeth returned from a clandestine meeting with an investigative journalist, headlights blinded her on a narrow forest road. The car behind her accelerated, horns blaring in the pitch-black night. It was a deliberate attempt to force her off the road, to end the pursuit of truth once and for all. She swerved, heart hammering, barely maintaining control as the vehicle lurched dangerously close. That night was a brutal reminder. The hunters were closing in. But the attack only fueled Elizabeth's resolve. She doubled down, gathering evidence, connecting dots, and exposing patterns that even seasoned investigators had missed. She uncovered documents detailing the trafficking of missing persons, financial transactions laundering money through legitimate businesses, and secret meetings in shadowed backrooms where deals were struck with cold calculation. More horrifying were the revelations of abuse perpetrated under the watchful eyes of those who should have intervened. Officials who should have been champions of justice were instead architects of deception. The Tollett family had become a symbol of resistance, a flicker of light in a landscape smothered by darkness. Their story inspired others, victims, witnesses, whistleblowers, to break their silence, risking everything to confront the monstrous system. But the price was steep. Allies were threatened, lives endangered, and the community fractured by fear. Elizabeth understood the stake. Heirs exposed the truth and risked destruction or remain silent and let the shadows reign. Her choice was clear. In a world where power corrupts absolutely, standing against it is an act of defiance that demands everything. And as the mountains watch in cold silence, the question remains, how many more will fall before the empire of shadows crumbles? The nightmare deepened when Elizabeth's phone exploded in a flood of anonymous threats, each more vicious than the last. "Stop digging or we'll finish what the mountains started." One message warned. The family's isolation was complete. Friends withdrew, fearful of association. Even the local grocery store refused service. It was a silent declaration. The Tolletts were marked, their lives forfeit to a shadow war waged in the dark. Yet in that suffocating loneliness, Elizabeth discovered an unexpected ally. A former detective named Harold, who had resigned in disgust years earlier after refusing to cover up evidence. Harold's insider knowledge was invaluable. He confirmed that the police department was riddled with corruption, with officers receiving payoffs to bury investigations and intimidate families like the Tolletts. Together they began piecing together a grim mosaic, a covert operation laundering money through Appalachian businesses, trafficking routes disguised as logging and mining enterprises, and a revolving door between law enforcement and criminal enterprises. Harold revealed chilling truths: how cases were closed by shifting paperwork, how witness statements were manipulated, and how entire families were effectively erased from the system. But Harold warned Elizabeth, those who pulled the strings were ruthless and well-connected, with tentacles reaching far beyond the mountains. Their power was systemic, embedded in political offices and corporate boardrooms. The closer Elizabeth and Harold got to the truth, the more perilous their path became. Surveillance intensified, break-ins became frequent, and violent intimidation escalated. A trusted friend was found dead under suspicious circumstances, the official report hastily labeling it a tragic accident. The message was clear: some secrets came with deadly price tags. Yet Elizabeth's will remained unbroken. She recorded conversations, gathered documents, and prepared a dossier so damning it could not be ignored. But as the mountain shadows closed in, the question lingered: could justice prevail in a world where the guardians of law were also the architects of crime? The Tollett family's saga was no longer a local tragedy. It was a mirror held up to a broken system, a call to confront the darkness before it claimed more victims. And now the choice belongs to you. Will you look away, or will you stand in the light against the shadows? The pressure mounted relentlessly as Elizabeth and Harold's investigation peeled back layer after layer of a vast, suffocating conspiracy. Every new revelation revealed an uglier truth, one more difficult to confront. The trafficking ring was just a symptom of a power structure so deeply entrenched that it had become invisible, operating through fear, silence, and manipulation. The mountains themselves seemed to hold their breath as the story unfolded, ghostly witnesses to crimes too vile to be spoken aloud. Elizabeth's days blurred into nights filled with whispers and threats, her every move shadowed by men who wore badges and carried guns, but answered only to corruption. A trusted ally in the local courthouse mysteriously vanished, leaving behind a stack of documents that detailed money laundering and illicit land seizures tied directly to the ring. The very institutions meant to protect citizens were complicit, their complicity sealed by fear and greed. The church, which once offered solace, had become a mouthpiece for obedience, preaching submission to the natural order, a cruel euphemism for maintaining control over a terrified population. Elizabeth's family was fractured, but her spirit was unbreakable. In a desperate bid to expose the truth, she planned to leak the evidence to national media, hoping the spotlight would force accountability. But before she could act, the network struck back with brutal efficiency. Her home was firebombed in the dead of night, leaving nothing but ashes and shattered memories. The message was clear: stop now, or be consumed by the flames. Forced into hiding, Elizabeth realized the true extent of the network's reach. No place was safe, no refuge secure. Yet in the darkness of her exile, the story found new life. Whistleblowers emerged, survivors came forward, and a groundswell of outrage began to stir beyond the mountain. The Tollett family's nightmare became a symbol of resistance, a rallying cry against a system built on lies and violence. But the battle was far from over. The empire of shadows was not easily dismantled. It fought back with ferocity, swallowing those who dared to stand against it. And as you listen now, remember this: the greatest crimes are not those hidden in the past, but those allowed to continue in silence. The choice to confront or ignore is yours. Choose wisely. In the cold aftermath of the firebombing, Elizabeth vanished from public view, but her fight was far from over. Underground and determined, she became a ghost, moving through shadows, communicating in coded messages, and forging alliances with others who had suffered beneath the network's iron fist. The isolation was suffocating, but it sharpened her resolve. Every step was a calculated risk, every meeting a test of trust. Yet, even in hiding, the web of corruption reached for her like a predator stalking prey. Anonymous threats escalated into violent attempts on her life. Once, a bullet shattered the window beside her as she worked by candlelight. Another time, a car followed her for miles before disappearing into the night. The forces arrayed against her were relentless, backed by power far beyond what most could imagine. Elizabeth found allies among survivors who, like her, bore the scars of this shadow empire. Together, they formed a network of resistance, sharing stories, evidence, and hope. Their voices, once silenced by fear, began to coalesce into a chorus demanding justice. But the cost was steep. Families were torn apart, friendships destroyed, and lives upended. The price of defiance in Appalachia was steep, paid in blood loss and unrelenting fear. Yet Elizabeth's courage inspired others. Investigative journalists took notice, piecing together fragments of her story into a narrative too explosive to ignore. National media attention forced local authorities to act, or at least pretend to. Official inquiries were launched, hearings held, and promises made. But beneath the surface, the machinery of corruption hummed quietly, waiting for the storm to pass so it could tighten its grip once more. Elizabeth knew this game all too well. Every victory was temporary, every step forward shadowed by retaliation. But her story was a beacon, a warning that even the darkest shadows could be pierced by light. The Tollett family's nightmare was no longer theirs alone. It was a symbol of systemic rot, a call to arms for anyone who refuses to accept silence as justice. And as you hear this, remember that the fight against darkness is never over. It lives in every whisper, every secret, every shadow, and only those willing to face it can ever hope to survive. The tentative victory that came with media exposure was bittersweet. Headlines splashed the Tollett name across the nation, casting light on horrors that had long been buried beneath the Appalachian soil. But the glare of public attention was a double-edged sword. Exposing the network forced it to tighten its grip and retaliate with even greater ferocity. Elizabeth's allies vanished without a trace, their disappearances whispered about but never explained. Evidence she painstakingly gathered was dismissed in courts riddled with bribery and intimidation. The network's operatives infiltrated every level of justice, bending laws like fragile branches to shield their dark empire. Elizabeth herself became a target for character assassination, portrayed as unstable, delusional, even dangerous, classic tactics to discredit those who challenge power. The Tollett family's story became a cautionary tale for others who dared speak out. Yet beneath the surface, a quiet revolution was brewing. Survivors and whistleblowers, once paralyzed by fear, began banding together, exchanging stories and strategies in secret. Elizabeth's courage had ignited a spark that could not be extinguished. New investigations, fueled by anonymous tips and leaked documents, chipped away at the network's armor. But progress was slow and perilous. Elizabeth lived with the constant threat of violence and betrayal, trusting few and watching every shadow. The mountains, once a sanctuary, had become a battleground where justice was a weapon wielded by those in power, and truth was a commodity bought and sold. The cost of resistance was clear: fear, isolation, and the constant threat of death. Yet Elizabeth refused to yield. Her battle was no longer just for her family, but for every silenced voice crushed beneath the weight of corruption. The Tollett legacy was a scar carved deep into the land, a reminder that darkness thrives where silence reigns. And now, as you listen to this, know that the power to break the cycle lies not just in telling the story, but in choosing to confront the shadows wherever they lurk. Because true courage is not the absence of fear, it is the choice to stand in the darkness and fight. The deeper Elizabeth waded into the morass of deceit, the clearer it became that the roots of the corruption stretched far beyond Appalachia's rugged hills. What had begun as a desperate search for her family's killers evolved into a battle against a sprawling syndicate, one with tentacles wrapped around industries, governments, and even religious institutions across the nation. Elizabeth uncovered coded communications, financial ledgers, and encrypted files that revealed how illicit profits flowed seamlessly through legitimate businesses, logging companies, mining operations, even charitable foundations. Each front masked horrors beneath, trafficking human lives and perpetuating cycles of poverty and fear. The faces of those involved were both familiar and terrifying. Prominent local leaders, law enforcement officials, and clergy who preached sanctity by day and sealed deals by night. The system was designed to be invisible, maintained by fear, and enforced by brutal silence. Those who stepped out of line disappeared or were discredited, their lives unraveling under mysterious circumstances. Elizabeth's network of allies grew, but so did the dangers. Informants were hunted, their families threatened. Elizabeth herself was forced into deeper shadows, moving from safe house to safe house, her existence a constant test of endurance. Yet, despite the crushing weight of fear, the story spread. Whispers turned into rumors, rumors into headlines, and headlines into a movement demanding accountability. Public outcry grew, forcing reluctant politicians to investigate, but every step forward was met with obstruction and subterfuge. The syndicate's power was a fortress, fortified by greed, influence, and ruthless tactics. Elizabeth's fight became a symbol of resistance not only in Appalachia, but across the nation, a reminder that even the most entrenched darkness can be challenged by unwavering courage. But the toll was steep. The line between hunter and hunted blurred, friends turned into enemies, trust became a precious commodity. The shadows that haunted Elizabeth were no longer just external. They lived within her, a constant battle between hope and despair. And as you listen now, understand this: the forces that seek to control and silence are vast, but so too is the power of a single voice willing to speak the truth. The question is not whether darkness exists, it is whether you will stand in the light and face it. The Tollett family's story had become a beacon in the abyss, but with every flicker of light came darker shadows. Elizabeth's relentless pursuit of justice attracted dangerous attention from powerful adversaries who wielded influence far beyond the mountains. A coalition of corporate interests, corrupted officials, and shadowy enforcers worked tirelessly to dismantle her efforts, employing tactics that blurred the lines between legality and outright violence. One chilling night, Elizabeth narrowly escaped an ambush orchestrated on a winding back road, a stark reminder that the stakes were life and death. Her survival only deepened her resolve. She forged alliances with whistleblowers embedded within the network, insiders who risked everything to leak information. Together they exposed the interconnected web of crime: human trafficking disguised as employment, illegal land seizures masked by forged documents, and an unholy alliance between profiteers and corrupt clergy preaching obedience over justice. Each revelation peeled back another layer of the monstrous system, revealing a nightmare where power fed on fear and silence was enforced with brutality. But the network's response was swift and merciless. Witnesses disappeared, evidence was destroyed or doctored, and public officials turned a blind eye, protecting the empire that thrived in darkness. Elizabeth's life became a constant dance between visibility and concealment, a perilous balance of speaking out while avoiding the deadly reach of those who wished to see her silenced. The mountains, once a refuge, now echoed with the cries of those broken by a system designed to exploit and erase. Yet within this suffocating silence, a spark persisted. The growing movement of survivors, activists, and journalists who refused to forget the Tollett family's plight forced a reluctant reckoning. Trials were held, investigations launched, but justice remained elusive, mired in corruption and intimidation. Elizabeth understood the bitter truth. The machinery of oppression was designed not to be defeated, but to wear down those who dared resist. Yet she refused to yield. Her fight was no longer about one family. It was a battle against an empire built on fear and deception. And now, as you hear this, know this truth. True courage is not the absence of fear, but the choice to stand and face the darkness no matter the cost. The winter's chill seeped into Elizabeth's bones, mirroring the cold, relentless grip of the network closing in around her. Each day was a perilous journey through shadows. She moved cautiously, trusting no one, aware that betrayal lurked in familiar faces. The mountain roads became arteries of danger, whispers of her movements carrying warnings to unseen enemies. The firebombing had destroyed her home, but not her will. Instead, it birthed a new kind of resilience, a resolve forged in fire and loss. Elizabeth took her fight to digital battlegrounds, encrypting messages, connecting with activists and journalists beyond the reach of local corruption. But technology was a double-edged sword. Surveillance was constant, and she learned that her phones were compromised, emails hacked, locations tracked. The very tools meant to spread truth had become instruments of control, yet amid the danger a breakthrough came. An anonymous whistleblower within the traffickers' ranks leaked documents revealing the identities of high-ranking officials and corporate partners involved in the operation. The papers detailed illicit transactions, shipping manifests, and disturbing photographs that chronicled the human cost of the network's greed. The evidence was damning, but the response was predictable. Denials, smear campaigns, and threats intensified. The Tollett family's name was twisted into a tale of hysteria and conspiracy. Elizabeth's allies faced intimidation, some forced into silence by fear, others disappeared without explanation. Still, the truth clawed its way into the daylight. National media outlets took up the cause, shining a spotlight on Appalachia's dark underbelly and the insidious system of exploitation thriving there. Public pressure mounted, forcing reluctant politicians to launch investigations, but progress was agonizingly slow, hampered by layers of bureaucracy and overt resistance. The network fought back with every tool at its disposal: legal threats, surveillance, and violent intimidation. Elizabeth's life had become a tightrope walk between exposure and invisibility, each step fraught with danger. Yet despite the relentless assault, her voice never faltered. The Tollett family's tragedy was no longer just a story. It was a symbol of systemic corruption, a warning that darkness flourishes where silence is allowed. And as you listen, know this: the shadows thrive on ignorance and fear. To break their hold, you must choose to see, to speak, and to fight. The assault on Elizabeth's life escalated beyond mere threats. Physical violence became the language of those desperate to maintain their grip. One evening, as she returned from a clandestine meeting, her car was ambushed on a desolate stretch of mountain road. Shots rang out, shattering the stillness and her rear window, leaving her shaken but alive, a narrow escape that confirmed the brutal lengths the network would go to protect its secrets. This attack was a message: stop now, or die trying. But Elizabeth's defiance only grew fiercer. From the shadows, she coordinated with other survivors and whistleblowers, their stories woven together to form an unassailable tapestry of truth. They uncovered horrific patterns: children sold under the guise of adoption, laborers trapped in debt bondage, families stripped of land and voice. The network operated with chilling efficiency, using bribery, blackmail, and violence to silence opposition. As the noose tightened, even the media outlets that once championed her cause began to pull back, intimidated by the power and reach of those behind the conspiracy. Elizabeth's allies dwindled, many forced underground or lost to mysterious accidents. Yet, amid the desolation, a movement took root. Small, determined cells of activists and survivors who refused to let the darkness swallow their stories. They used encrypted communication, guerrilla tactics, and covert meetings to evade detection and spread awareness. The mountains echoed with their whispered promises of justice. Elizabeth's personal sacrifices were immense. She lost friends, endured isolation, and lived with the constant specter of death. But the spark of resistance she ignited could not be extinguished. Each revelation weakened the network's facade, exposing the rot at its core. The Tollett family's tragedy became a rallying cry, a symbol of the fight against a system that eyed on the powerless and punished those who dared resist. As you hear this, understand the stakes. The battle against darkness is not fought with swords or guns, but with truth, courage, and relentless defiance. And now the question is yours. Will you stand in the light or turn away and let the shadows claim another victim? The grip of the network was tightening like a steel vice, squeezing every ounce of hope from the community it controlled. Elizabeth's warnings had become a siren's cry in the wilderness, heard by few, dismissed by many, and feared by all who understood the true cost of resistance. Her safe houses were compromised one by one, forcing her into deeper shadows where trust was a luxury she could no longer afford. The walls seemed to close in, the night air thick with menace and the unspoken threat of violence. Yet, amidst the encroaching darkness, a critical breakthrough came from an unexpected source. A young woman, a survivor who had escaped the trafficking ring, emerged from the silence with testimony so harrowing it shook the foundations of the conspiracy. Her words revealed not only the horrors endured, but the complicity of those who wielded power with ruthless efficiency. The survivors' courage galvanized Elizabeth and her dwindling allies, injecting new life into their desperate crusade. Together they orchestrated a plan to expose the network's financial lifelines, shell companies, offshore accounts, and legitimate fronts used to launder profits from human misery. It was a dangerous gambit, requiring infiltration and subterfuge, but the stakes demanded nothing less. Meanwhile, the network retaliated with escalating brutality. Witnesses were silenced, whistleblowers disappeared, and violent raids struck at the heart of the resistance. The very fabric of the community frayed under the pressure, families torn apart by fear and suspicion. Elizabeth herself narrowly survived another assassination attempt, a brutal beating in a deserted alley that left her battered but unbroken. The cost of truth was now measured in blood and sacrifice. Yet the tide was slowly turning. The young survivor's testimony broke through media barriers, sparking national outrage and forcing reluctant state officials to act. Investigations that had long been stymied found new momentum, as federal agencies stepped in to probe the depths of the corruption. But even as the network's empire showed cracks, its defenders fought with desperate ferocity, threatening, bribing, and manipulating to protect their crumbling fortress. And so the war raged on, a battle of shadows and light where every victory was hard won and every loss deeply felt. The Tollett family's story remains a stark reminder. Darkness thrives where silence rules, but even the smallest spark can ignite a revolution. Will you be the flame that burns through the shadows? The fragile momentum of justice was a candle flickering against a tempest of corruption. As federal agents descended on Appalachia, a facade of law and order was restored, at least in public view. But behind closed doors, the machinery of the network churned with renewed vigor, scrambling to salvage what remained of its empire. Elizabeth watched the spectacle with a hardened gaze. She knew the ritual of investigations, hearings, and indictments were often a masquerade, enough to appease public outrage, but rarely enough to dismantle the true power structures. The arrests that made headlines were carefully chosen pawns, sacrificial lambs offered to protect the architects pulling the strings from the shadows. The deeper conspirators cloaked themselves in layers of plausible deniability, their names absent from any official document, their influence wielded through intermediaries and front companies. Elizabeth's allies faced relentless harassment, legal battles, media smears, and even violence designed to fracture their resolve. Yet the underground network of survivors and activists grew more determined, driven by a bitter knowledge that true justice demanded more than surface-level victories. Amid the mounting pressure, new evidence surfaced, digital records, financial trails, and testimonies that exposed how deeply entwined the network was with political campaigns, business interests, and even religious institutions preaching complicity under the guise of faith. The scale of the betrayal was staggering, the layers of deception seemingly endless. Elizabeth realized that the fight was no longer just about exposing crimes. It was about dismantling a system designed to perpetuate them. But the system fought back with savage efficiency. Intimidation turned to outright violence. Allies disappeared, some found dead in suspicious circumstances. Whispers of covert operations to suppy. Rest dissent grew louder, painting a grim picture of a state within a state where power was absolute and accountability a myth. Yet through it all, Elizabeth refused to be silenced. Her story had become a beacon for those who dared to resist, a testament to the brutal cost of truth in a world ruled by shadows. And as you listen now, remember, darkness thrives where silence reigns, but courage is the weapon that can shatter even the deepest shadows. The crushing weight of betrayal and violence was a relentless storm, but Elizabeth refused to bend beneath it. As whispers of covert repression grew louder, she knew the network's true strength lay not only in corruption, but in its ability to manipulate fear and fracture alliances. The mountains, once silent witnesses, now echoed with the low hum of a battle fought in shadows, an endless war between those who sought to expose and those determined to conceal. Elizabeth's inner circle became a fortress of whispered plans and encrypted messages, each move a gamble against unseen eyes. Yet even here, trust was a fragile illusion. Infiltrators lurked among them, planting seeds of doubt and misinformation. The cost of resistance was brutal. Friends vanished overnight, some reappeared with broken spirits or twisted loyalties, others became casualties in a war waged in the dark. Despite the isolation, Elizabeth pressed on, her resolve fueled by memories of the Tollett family's shattered lives and the countless others swallowed by the system. She worked tirelessly to document the network's atrocities, collecting testimonies from survivors too terrified to speak openly, piecing together financial trails that led to the highest echelons of power. But the fight had become as much psychological as physical. The network employed psychological warfare, intimidation, gaslighting, and orchestrated smears to break the will of those who dared resist. Elizabeth endured months of calculated harassment, hacked devices, doctored videos, and public defamation campaigns aimed at turning public opinion against her. Yet, in the face of relentless darkness, her spirit remained unbroken. Her story became a symbol, a rallying point for those lost in fear and silence. The network's facade cracked under the weight of truth, but the fight was far from over. Behind the scenes, the gears of corruption continued to turn, protected by shadows and silence. Elizabeth understood that victory would not come in a single moment, but in the slow, grinding erosion of power. And as you hear this, know this: the battle against darkness is endless, but so too is the power of a single, unwavering voice. Will you be the one to speak? Will you stand in the shadows or step into the light? The choice is yours. As Elizabeth edged closer to the heart of the conspiracy, the stakes escalated beyond anything she had imagined. The network's puppeteers were no longer content with intimidation and veiled threats. They were moving to eliminate her permanently. A cold realization settled over her. This was not just a fight for justice, it was a war for survival. The sprawling corruption she uncovered revealed a dark symbiosis between power and violence, where death was merely a tool to maintain order. One night, while preparing to meet a key informant, Elizabeth sensed the eyes watching her from the shadows. She escaped an ambush by seconds, the echo of gunfire shattering the silence as she fled through the forest. It was a brutal message: stop now or be erased. But surrender was not in her nature. Instead, she used the attack as a catalyst, intensifying her efforts to dismantle the empire built on fear. The evidence she and her allies gathered was staggering: documents linking politicians to trafficking rings, bank accounts funneling millions, and clandestine meetings where futures were bought and sold like commodities. Yet for every step forward, the network responded with ruthless countermeasures. Media blackouts, falsified reports, and the systematic targeting of witnesses. The psychological warfare was relentless. Elizabeth's nights were haunted by paranoia and the relentless fear that every shadow concealed a deadly enemy. The Tollett family's tragedy had transformed into a symbol of resistance, but also a beacon for predators hungry to silence the light. Despite the isolation, Elizabeth's message spread, carried on encrypted channels and whispered in hidden circles. Survivors found hope in her unwavering defiance. Activists and journalists rallied to her cause, building a fragile but growing coalition determined to expose the rot at the core of power. Yet even as the tide seemed to turn, the true depth of the conspiracy remained elusive. Layers of deception, betrayal, and complicity obscured the path to justice. And so the war raged on, an unending battle fought not only in courts and newsrooms, but in the hearts and minds of those brave enough to stand against the darkness. As you listen now, remember, the greatest power lies not in silence, but in the courage to speak. Will you join the fight? Will you be the voice that shatters the shadows? In the endless night of this war, Elizabeth realized that the network's greatest weapon was not violence, but invisibility, the ability to operate unseen, protected by layers of silence and fear. Each revelation she uncovered was met with an orchestrated campaign to erase it from public consciousness, to bury the truth beneath a mountain of lies. She learned that even those sworn to serve justice were pawns in a game far larger than they imagined, trapped in a system where loyalty to power outweighed any oath or duty. One night, a trusted source delivered damning evidence, a ledger detailing payments made to high-ranking officials, including judges, law enforcement, and politicians, names carefully redacted but unmistakable to those who knew the corridors of power. This was the tip of an iceberg so vast it threatened to sink the very fabric of governance. Yet as she prepared to expose these secrets, Elizabeth faced betrayal within her own ranks. A mole feeding information back to the network, undermining their efforts and endangering lives. Paranoia tightened its grip, trust became a scarce commodity, and every ally's loyalty was tested. The psychological toll was immense. Sleepless nights filled with fear, constant vigilance against unseen threats, and the crushing knowledge that the enemy was everywhere. Despite this, Elizabeth pressed on, fueled by a grim determination to bring light to the darkness, no matter the cost. She coordinated with independent investigators, whistleblowers, and journalists, willing to risk everything to tell the story. Their work was painstaking, fraught with setbacks and danger, but progress came in small, precious victories, leaks that sparked public outrage, secret testimonies that forced reluctant officials to act, and slow unraveling of the network's tangled web. The Tollett family's nightmare had become a symbol of systemic rot, a call to confront the evil thriving in silence. And as you listen now, understand this: the greatest chains are forged by fear and ignorance. Breaking them requires the courage to see, to speak, and to fight. The darkness thrives when silence reigns, but the light of truth, once ignited, can never be extinguished. Will you be that light? Will you face the shadows or retreat into darkness? The choice is yours. The battle for truth had become a labyrinth of shadows, and Elizabeth found herself navigating a twisted maze where allies vanished without warning and enemies wore familiar faces. The network's reach was so vast, its influence so insidious, that every step forward was a gamble with life itself. She uncovered layers of collusion that defied belief: local businesses laundering money for traffickers, politicians funded by illicit wealth, even religious leaders complicit in the silence that enabled these horrors to persist. Each discovery peeled back another layer of deception, revealing a grotesque underworld where human lives were mere currency and justice a hollow promise. Yet the network's most chilling tactic was not the overt violence, but the slow erosion of hope. Smear campaigns painted Elizabeth as a liar, a lunatic, someone whose revelations were dismissed as fantasy or conspiracy. The community, worn down by fear and years of silence, struggled to know whom to trust. But amidst the despair, sparks of resistance ignited. Survivors found courage in each other's stories, activists pushed back against censorship, and investigative journalists risked everything to expose the truth. Elizabeth's fight had become larger than her family, a fight for every silenced voice, every crushed spirit. But the cost was steep. One by one, her closest allies were broken, some disappeared, others discredited or destroyed by relentless attacks on their character and sanity. The network's claws dug deeper, their tactics evolving into psychological warfare designed to fracture bonds and isolate those who resisted. Elizabeth faced moments when the weight of the fight threatened to crush her, when the shadows seemed too vast to overcome. But in those darkest hours, the memory of the Tollett family's suffering steeled her resolve. Theirs was a story that could not be buried, a legacy that demanded reckoning. As the walls closed in, Elizabeth prepared for the ultimate confrontation, a reckoning that would shake the foundations of the empire built on fear. And as you hear this, know that the fight against darkness is not for the faint of heart. It demands sacrifice, courage, and unyielding resolve. The question remains: will you stand and face the shadows, or will you let them consume all that is good and just? The choice is yours. The night air was thick with menace as Elizabeth prepared for the final push, a desperate gambit to expose the network's core before it could silence her forever. Every step was measured, every breath a calculated risk, knowing that the hunters closing in were not mere criminals, but architects of an empire built on cruelty and deceit. She convened a secret meeting with her remaining allies, a ragtag coalition of survivors, whistleblowers, and fearless journalists. The evidence amassed was staggering: financial records tracing millions through offshore accounts, witness testimonies shattering alibis, and a damning dossier linking powerful figures to human suffering and death. But the path forward was perilous. The network's response was swift and brutal. Threats escalated into violence, safe houses were compromised, and the once solid alliances began to fracture under pressure. Paranoia seeped into the group, suspicion corroded trust, and every shadow seemed alive with danger. Elizabeth's resolve was tested as never before, facing not only external enemies but the internal torment of doubt and exhaustion. The mountains bore silent witness to her relentless pursuit, their cold peaks a stark reminder of the isolation and sacrifice demanded by this fight. Yet, amid the chaos, a spark of hope flickered. An anonymous source within the network's highest echelons offered a way forward, a secret meeting that could unmask the puppeteers pulling the strings. The risk was immense. Betrayal lurked at every turn. But for Elizabeth, the chance to finally break the cycle of silence and corruption was worth the gamble. As the night deepened, the network's shadow stretched ever closer, but so too did the light of truth. The Tollett family's legacy had become a beacon for the voiceless, a testament to courage in the face of overwhelming darkness. And as you listen now, know this: the bat. For justice is a war fought in the shadows, but it is also a fight that demands light. The choice to stand, to speak, and to fight lies with you. Will you be the voice that shatters the silence? Will you confront the darkness or retreat into it? The decision is yours, and it will define the fate of many. The final confrontation loomed like a gathering storm, an inevitable collision between truth and the monstrous web of lies spun over decades. Elizabeth's every move was shadowed by danger, but she refused to falter. The secret meeting arranged by her mysterious insider was her last hope, a chance to pull back the curtain on the empire that had thrived on human misery, to expose the puppet masters who had remained untouchable. In a forgotten warehouse on the outskirts of a town swallowed by Appalachia's gloom, Elizabeth met with figures cloaked in fear and defiance. Among them were fractured souls, disillusioned enforcers, repentant officials, and survivors whose courage outshone their pain. They laid bare the network's final secrets: offshore accounts masked as charities, land deals that erased entire communities, and the shadowy corridors where politics and crime were indistinguishable. But as the truth spilled into the cold air, the network's response was swift and brutal. Enforcers stormed the warehouse, gunfire echoing through the night. Elizabeth barely escaped, the roar of destruction a haunting reminder of what was at stake. The battle was no longer just about exposing crime. It was about survival, about ensuring that the darkness that had claimed so many would be dismantled piece by piece. Back in hiding, Elizabeth compiled the final dossier, an unassailable indictment of a system that fed on fear and silence. Her hands trembled not with fear, but with the weight of responsibility. The Tollett family's nightmare was no longer theirs alone. It was a symbol of systemic rot that demanded reckoning. The battle had scarred her, but it had also forged an unbreakable resolve. The mountains, once a prison of secrets, now held the promise of justice, if only the world was willing to listen. And now, as you listen, understand this: darkness thrives when silence rules, but courage to speak is the first spark of revolution. Will you be that spark? Will you stand in the light and confront the shadows, or will you let the darkness claim another soul? The choice is yours. Choose wisely. Choose courage. The smoke from the final battle had barely cleared, but the scars carved into Appalachia's heart ran far deeper than any blaze. Elizabeth knew that while the network had been fractured, the true evil lingered, hidden, adapting, waiting for complacency to return. The Tollett family's tragedy had opened a wound that bled truth into the light, but the system's rot was like a cancer, spreading beneath the surface, fueled by silence and fear. In the weeks that followed, the media's spotlight shifted. Distractions took center stage, and the politicians who promised justice quietly retreated behind closed doors. Many so-called victories were hollow, carefully choreographed to preserve the facade, while the real puppeteers slipped through cracks and shadows. Survivors still suffered in silence, their voices muffled by trauma and the threat of retribution. Elizabeth vanished into obscurity, a ghost among ghosts, her mission transforming from exposing the past to safeguarding the fragile flame of resistance. She became a whisper on encrypted channels, a symbol of relentless defiance against the darkness that refused to die. The mountains remained, silent sentinels watching over a land still haunted by secrets too terrible to fully reveal. Yet, even in the face of overwhelming odds, the spark of rebellion burned on. Every act of courage, every refusal to stay silent, chipped away at the empire built on lies and violence. The Tollett family's legacy was a testament to the cost of truth, a reminder that darkness only thrives when the brave choose to look away. Now, as you listen to this final echo of a story stained with blood and betrayal, understand this: the battle against hidden evils is eternal, fought in shadows and whispered truths. The question that remains is not whether darkness exists, but whether you will choose to stand in the light. Will you bear the burden of knowledge and face the consequences? Or will you let silence and fear dictate your path? The choice is yours, and in that choice lies the power to shape not just your destiny, but the fate of countless others trapped in the shadows. Remember the Tollett family, remember the cost, and remember this: courage is the weapon that breaks chains and shatters silence. Choose courage, choose truth, choose to fight. If this story moved you, if you feel the weight of these truths and the fire to stand against the shadows, then don't keep it to yourself. Share this video, let others hear the secrets buried in Appalachia's dark past. Subscribe now to join the fight, to stay connected to stories that expose the hidden forces shaping our world. And if you believe in courage, hit that like button, because every click is a step toward breaking silence. Together we shine light into darkness.